Okay, I'm going to make an audio recording now of the second Frankenstein PowerPoint that I sent to you guys. And this one is going to cover chapters 11 through chapter 16, which are the chapters that are from the monster's point of view. So we talked about before the bullseye layout of the book, how we have Walton's point of view, and then Frankenstein's point of view, and then the monster's point of view in the center, and then we're going to go back to Frankenstein's point of view, and then end with Walton's point of view. So in chapter 11, the point of view shifts again. This time it is to the monster. So this is the center of the bullseye. Now that's significant. There's a structure in some ancient poetry called a chiasmus, and this actually is similar. Chiasmus, Chiasmus. Probably won't be on the test, but it's something interesting for you to know anyway. Chiasmus was a poetic form in which you had it kind of started one way and then went to something else and then came back to the first way. And so this bullseye thing is kind of a chiasmus. Now the significant thing about that is though, is that in a chiasmus, the thing that is in the middle ends up being the most important, most crucial part of it. So that probably means that this part in the middle is the most important part, both in terms of plot and also in terms of theme. Now again, the difference, plot is what happens in a story. Theme is the message that the reader is supposed to take from the story. So the difference being that the plot is that in Titanic the boat sinks, blah 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 blah. The theme is that man cannot, pride goeth before a fall or whatever. The message that you're supposed to take away from it. So both of those, the plot and theme, should find their focus here in this section. So in chapter 11, we start off with the monster speaking, and he starts off by telling about his vague memories of his first night alive. He describes going outside, seeing the moon, eating berries, drinking from a brook, and all that sort of thing. He mentions that he had taken some clothes from Frankenstein's apartment before he left to cover himself up, which again shows a great deal of foresight for a creature that has just come to life. I mean, a baby doesn't do that. So the monster is more than a baby. He's got some kind of a developed mind, even though he hasn't, even though he's very, very young as far as how long he's been alive. But he takes some clothes from Frankenstein's apartment before he left. Now this becomes very important later, so hang on to that and don't forget about that. So while he's out there in the forest, he says that he hears the birds singing and he tries to imitate that sound, but he finds that he cannot do it very well. So he's already trying to communicate and talk. So then one day, as he's wandering around, he finds a fire. And you're immediately thinking, oh, fire, bad, monster hates fire. Well, no. That's something that actually in the novel, the creature has no fear of fire. That's something they created for the 1931 film, and it becomes kind of like in our brains that that's how Frankenstein's monster is. In the novel, no, he has no fear of fire. In fact, he sits down beside it and he discovers that it's warm, discovers that he can cook things on it. He kind of examines it like a scientist. He's testing it, reflecting on it, trying to figure out how it works. And the reader can tell then that the monster is very intelligent, very scientific. We're meant to feel sympathy and admiration for the creature as it's doing this. And the next thing that happens as he continues through the forest, he runs into okay, I'm sorry, this thing is paused. There it is. He finds this little hut, and there's an old man in the hut, and the man runs away in fear. And the creature doesn't understand why he ran. Doesn't see, well, why is this guy running away? It's the first time he's seen a human being up close, and he runs away. And he doesn't understand why yet. Eventually, he does figure out why. But right now, at this point, he says that he didn't understand why he was running away. But he is very impressed with the hut, which he's never seen something like that before, and apparently it's new to him. He says that he's impressed that it keeps off all the snow and the rain. So this is wonderful for him, and he enjoys the old man's breakfast, which he has left behind, and he likes this food. He's never had food like this before. Later, he goes on to a village where he says he sees many huts, and he's also looking for more of this kind of food. And the people, when they see him, they shriek, and they faint, and they throw things at him. And the creature is very surprised by this. He runs away and he hides himself in a hovel, which is a little shack that's attached to a small house. And he says he does this to escape the barbarity of man. Now, that's an interesting thought, because when we think of barbarity, again, being like a barbarian, being like a monster, like a creature that can't be reasoned with, we think that the creature is like that. But this brings up the idea, who is the real monster? Which is a question that is perpetuated all through the novel, but especially in the parts here where we have the point of view of the creature. Which one is the real monster? Is the creature a monster, or is mankind a monster? Because they treat him like this when he's done nothing wrong. So who is the real monster? And here we have a little thing where I like this is from a children's story here, and it says, I'd like to visit the village, but the villagers are scared of me. And they say, it's Frankenstein's monster. And he says, hello. And then they scare me too. Rah, rah, stomp, stomp. And that's basically what happens. He shows up. He doesn't say hello because he can't talk yet, but he tries to greet them and try to see if he can get food from them and stuff, and they chase him away. He hasn't done anything wrong now other than be ugly, which suggests that the human beings are really the real monsters here. So in chapter 11, as I said, near the end of it, he ends up in this hovel, which is attached to this building. And he's got a little hole. The creature's hovel is attached to a small house, and there's a little hole in the hovel where he can watch through, and there's a family in there. There's a little family on the other side. They don't know he's there, but there's an old blind man and his 2 children. And the creature doesn't reveal himself for fear of how the villagers reacted to him. He doesn't want that to happen again. And he just watches this family. And he watches them for almost a year, learning much from them. So this is where he's been throughout this winter, we find out. So in chapter 12, little by little, the creature learns about this family. First of all, he says that they are not entirely happy, and he's not sure exactly why, but he learns bit by bit. One cause he can see is poverty. The 2 younger ones often will go without food so that the father will not have to, and the creature is very impressed by this kindness. He's so impressed, in fact, that he learns this and he stops stealing their food, which he says he was doing before that. He would periodically take things from them because he needed to get food, and he figured, well, here's free food that I need to get. But when he learns that by him taking things from them, it increases their poverty, increases their unhappiness, he stops stealing their food. And he instead goes out into the forest to live on things that he can find in the forest at night, probably nuts and berries and things like this. Nuts, roots, and berries. Berries! Which I think is funny because then it brings up, hey, Frankenberries! Yes! Frankenstein's monster, rather, mostly lives on berries throughout most of this time that he's in, which gives a whole new meaning to that cereal that you guys are probably familiar with. Anyway, other parts of chapter 12, the monster spends the winter learning all he can, just kind of watching them and learning from them. He learns their names. He says their names are Father, Felix, and Agatha. Now, obviously, the father's name is not really Father, but that's what they call him, and so to him, that's what this person's name is, at least for a while. He decides not to reveal himself until he can speak better. That's probably a wise thing, because he doesn't want a repeat of what happened in the village, so he wants to be able to talk to them to make sure that they know what's going on. He does help the family out when he can, though. He cuts wood, he shovels snow, and he so on, does these things while the family is sleeping. So while they're asleep, he goes and does good things for them. And they do not know who is doing these good things for them. But he overhears them talking about their good spirit who's doing these secret things to help them out. So hang on to that in your head, the idea that before they see him, they refer to him as their good spirit. So doing good things is admirable, but when they see him, they don't have quite the same reaction. It says that he admires the perfect forms of the cottagers, and then he sees himself in a pool of water and learns that I am in reality the monster that I am. So he didn't really know what he looked like before then, but now, whether he can see himself in the mirror of the water and compare how he looks to how the people looks, and now you can say, oh, look, I really am a monster. This is a running theme in a lot of literature, the idea that you don't really know what you are until you're able to compare yourself with somebody else. And so the monster, once he's able to compare himself with these villagers, he sees that, yeah, I'm a real monster. Now, in chapter 13, we have a new character show up. A woman arrives at the house, and the creature talks about that Felix, the boy, had been sad for no reason that he could understand, but when the woman shows up, he is suddenly happy. And that ends up becoming important, so keep that in the back of your brain for a while. This is Safi, or Safi, I'm never sure how to pronounce that exactly. Anyway, this is a woman that Felix loves. Now, that is foreshadowing, because the monster has learned something very interesting, that you can be in total misery, and that misery can change to happiness because of the presence of a person that you love. How he puts his joy had taken the place of sadness in the family's lives. Now, the other reason that Safi exists here is that Safi does not speak their language, which is French, and so they teach her how to speak. Now, that's very convenient because that means as long as they're teaching her to speak, the creature can listen in and learn how to speak as well. This is another writer's trick because Mary Shelley wants for the creature to be able to speak so he can describe what he's feeling, but she knows that Frankenstein did not teach the creature to speak, so how do you learn? This is how, by watching Felix and the others teach Safi how to speak. Now, they teach Safi by reading to her from a book called The Ruins of Empires by C.F. Volney. That's a real book. And this is a book that reflects on the origins of human society and governments and laws and discusses why great empires fell. And the creature says that he gets a rudimentary knowledge of geography and of history and of religions from this book. Now, that's interesting that he puts it that way, though, because this is a bit of an allusion. That's with an A, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N, because Mary Shelley assumes that her readers know what this book is. And this is a book that reflects on the origins of human society, but it's also a critique of several different religions. Volney was considered a radical and almost an atheist because he wrote this thing and he kind of criticizes a lot of religion. And the creature assumes that this book is a simple truth of human history. So the significant thing about that is that Volney was very, very cynical about human nature. He considered humans to be not very admirable creatures. And so the idea that the monster learns his knowledge about human history from this guy that considers human beings to be very negative is significant. Now, the other thing that happens in chapter 13 as the monster is watching this, he reflects on what people value based on what Volney has said. He notices that people value money, a good descent, and having friends and relations. And he reflects that he himself has none of those things. So he considers himself to be the most miserable creature on the earth because all those things that people value are foreign to him. He has nothing like that at all. So then we get into chapter 14, and in this chapter we learn the sad history of the de Lacy family. That's the name of the family that the creature has been watching. They are from Paris, and it says that they were once wealthy and important, and of course they were, because here we are in the early 1800s, and we talked about before that, Elizabeth, when we found her, she couldn't just be a peasant girl that was sweet and wonderful. No. She needed to turn out to have a noble family that she had was just divorced from in some way. Same way, the de Lacys can't just be good-hearted peasants. No, of course, they need to have once been wealthy and important and noblemen, or else why should we pay attention? Now, that's very odd to us because we don't have the kind of classist nature that a lot of Europe had, especially back then. But whatever, the de Lacys were once wealthy and important in Paris. And apparently Felix saw a Turkish man that was condemned unjustly. He was condemned to a prison unjustly, and so he arranged to have the man rescued from this prison. Now, that's against the law, but Felix felt like he needed to follow his conscience. And the man, who was a Turk, offers to give his daughter to Felix for his help. Or Felix was going to help him anyway, but when he sees the daughter, he falls in love with the daughter. That daughter, that's Safi. And we find out from her story that she is a Christian, and she doesn't want to go back to Turkey. It says that her mother was a Christian that was kidnapped into Turkey or something like this, and had this daughter, taught her about Christianity, and so Safi doesn't want to go back to Turkey. Now again, this shows a little bit of Mary Shelley's religious bias, where she kind of feels like Christians are are better people than Muslims are, and that this again is a part of the time period where they just kind of felt like if somebody wasn't a Christian, then they couldn't be trusted to be a good person. In any case, though, after helping the Turk escape, Felix's father and sister are arrested. Um, so Felix returns to Paris to try to help his father and sister, and all three of them are stripped of all their possessions and banished from the country. It takes a couple months for that to happen, but they are banished from the country, and that is why they're living in poverty in Germany. Now, this Turkish man that Felix had helped, he was going to break his promise to help him and instead return to his home in Turkey and bring his daughter with him. And I guess, who could blame him for that? I mean, of course he'd be grateful for Felix for rescuing him, but at the same time, if Felix has now been condemned and shoved away, then he can't really help him anymore. So who could blame him for saying, well, I'm safe and I'm escaped, I need to go back home? But in the book, they do talk about this being a terrible thing, that he's betraying them like that. And Safi apparently feels that same way, and so she runs away from him and seeks out Felix and his family. And that's the story of the de Lacy family. This is how Safi has gotten there. Oh yes, now in chapter 15, the creature finds some books. He says he finds a little satchel that's got some books in it. He mentions that he's learned to read by watching them teach Safi how to read. Now, that's a little bit ridiculous. I mean, realistically, you can understand somebody learning how to speak if they're very smart by watching somebody else learn how to speak, but to learn how to read, you need to be able to actually see the book they're reading from, and that seems a little ridiculous to think that he could learn to read by watching them teach her to read. But whatever. I mean, after all, we are reading a book about a Walking Dead guy, so I guess we can go ahead and suspend our disbelief a little bit. Whatever, the creature can read. So he finds these books, and he mentions what the books are, and it's significant. Again, these are allusions because Mary Shelley assumes her readers would have known what these books were. The first one is called The Sorrows of Werther. This is a real story. It's a story of unrequited love about a guy named Werther who falls in love with this woman who's in love with another guy, and he just has this unrequited love for her, and eventually he commits suicide because even though he loves her, he knows that she's better off with this other guy, and so he commits suicide rather than saying they're being quiet. And it says the creature sympathizes with Werther because he says he also loves without any chance of it being returned. Now that's pretty sad and depressing. The second book he's got is Plutarch's Lives. Again, it's a real book. This is a historical portrayal of the lives of several famous Greek and Roman people. Now, this was written by a guy named Plutarch that lived during the Roman Empire. And he wrote about these different people. Some of them were real, some of them were fictional. But he wrote about all of them as if they were real, and the creature assumes that these people were all real. And it says that reading this or hearing this, reading this excites high thoughts in the creature, causing in him a love of virtue. So all of this is suggesting that he is a good creature, even though he's ugly and he has no friends, that he is in fact good, and which is of course is entirely his message. Oh yes, and the last book is the most important, which is Paradise Lost by John Milton. Now, if we had more time in this study of British literature, I would highly recommend that we read some of Paradise Lost. There was a really fabulous adaptation of Paradise Lost done at the Massachusetts Educational Theater Guild festival that Lynn Classical went to. It was called Fallen. It was their adaptation of, oh, wow, it was gorgeous. But anyway, Paradise Lost, for those who aren't aware, is a poetic retelling of the story of the Garden of Eden. For those who don't know, the Garden of Eden is the story in the Bible of God creating the first man, Adam, the first woman, Eve, putting them in a garden, and then the devil comes as a snake, tempts them into eating fruit, and that's how they fall away from the garden, and that leads into mortality in the mortal world that we live in. But the cool thing about Paradise Lost is that this is the same story, but it's told from the point of view of the devil. Now, this affects the creature even more deeply than the other ones, because as he reads this, he can very much identify with the main character. Satan, of course, calls God the villain, because, Satan is the bad guy, of course. We know that if we know the Bible at all. But from Satan's point of view, God's the bad guy for condemning him and shoving him down to hell. And the monster, the creature, can understand the idea of a god that will create you but then fight against its creations. He really identifies with that. And so he says he sometimes feels like Adam that was created for virtue, but much more often he feels like he is Satan, created by a God that then condemned him into misery. Except that he says both of these characters have companions. Satan has the devils that he rules over, and Adam obviously has Eve. And the creature, unlike them, is totally alone. And hang on to that in your mind, because this is what he's eventually going to be asking Frankenstein to fix. Okay, chapter 15. Remember that the creature took some clothes from Frankenstein's apartment on its first night alive? It turns out that there were some papers in the pockets of these clothes. And now that he can read it, the creature discovers that it is Frankenstein's journal of how he brought him to life. Now, this is important for several reasons, one of which is that now the monster knows the name of his creator. He knows that he was created by a guy named Frankenstein, and he also knows a little bit about where he was from. Now, 1 year has passed since that day that he was brought to life. He mentions that. And so I've got a little picture right here of the monster eating a little slice of birthday cake, which of course he doesn't have, but you get the idea. It's his birthday. He's 1 year old now. And at this point, the creature decides to talk to the DeLacys and beg for their help. And I see that this one, for some reason, didn't do the animations. That's okay. And he waits for a time when the old man is there alone, because he reasons that because the old man is blind and can't see, he'll be more willing to listen to him. Now, this shows the monster is smart enough to know that the major thing against him is that he is ugly. He knows his ugliness is against him. And so he wisely decides that rather than just showing up and saying, please help me, he's going to first approach the old man and try to get his sympathy, because the old man is blind and he'll be more willing to listen to him. Now, chapter 15 is very affecting and very sad. It's one of my favorite chapters. Read this dialogue if you haven't had a chance to do that. Read the dialogue between the monster and Mr. DeLacy. So the old man invites him in, and he gives him warmth and rest. He's a good man. He wants to help anybody that's in need. And the creature speaks about needing help, and how that he is innocent, but that others assume that he is guilty. And the old man is very kind and very generous, and he seems like he's very much willing to help him. And the creature dares to hope that maybe everything will turn out right. But then Felix, Agatha, and Safie arrive, and the first thing they do is they freak out, and Felix goes and starts hitting him with a stick. Felix attacks him, the women scream, and they faint. And the creature, in despair, flees and runs back and hides in its hovel. So he's caused all of this consternation, and he's very, very upset now. He's very, very angry because he feels like he may have blundered this. And he starts chapter 16 with this expression, cursed, cursed creator, why did I live? Now remember, the monster is telling this story to Frankenstein. So you can almost picture him stopping in the middle of his story and then turning to Frankenstein and saying, curse you, why did you make me live to endure this kind of pain? And the creature is filled with despair, and he says that that despair then changes into rage and revenge, which again is a very normal thing. When you're filled with all kinds of pain of being rejected, you sometimes turn towards rage and despair. And the creature, to his credit, he doesn't go hurting people. Instead, he goes out into the woods, and then he gives way to his anger, just yelling and breaking things. You can see him like howling and like smashing trees or something like that. And the next day, he's so angry that he's out there all night, angrily breaking things and shouting. And so when the next morning comes, he can't sneak back to the hovel, so he needs to stay in the woods. And so he stays in the woods, and eventually he begins to calm down and think to himself, okay, wait, maybe there's still a way to fix this. Maybe there's a way that we can fix this and I can still visit them again. So the next morning, he sneaks back, or the next night, I should say, he sneaks back into the hovel. And in the morning, he's in there, and he's waiting, but no one comes out of the house. And he realizes after a while that the DeLacy family has left. And the creature overhears. Felix shows up and talks to this man that's there, that's apparently buying this house from them. And the man says, are you sure you want to give this such a beautiful house and stuff like this? And the creature overhears Felix speaking to a man and saying, we can never inhabit this cottage again. And he talks about how that it's dangerous because there's great danger to my father, because and you get the sense that because of the monster coming to see them, they feel like they are in danger here. Felix believes they're all in danger from the creature and that the creature is going to hurt them. And this is very, very sad because if you remember, they considered the creature to be their good spirit, their good spirit, their good angel that was protecting them until they saw him. Now, hearing this, the creature again feels despair, and over the rest of the morning and the day, that despair burns back into a rage again. And he says, for the first time, the feelings of revenge and hatred filled my bosom, and I did not strive to control them. And then he says, from that moment, I declared everlasting war against the species, and more than all, against his creator, Frankenstein, for creating him. So that night, he burns the cottage to the ground. Just because he's so filled with anger and despair because he had reached out for love and was rejected. And then the creature goes off again, and he decides that he's going to go seek out Frankenstein, try to find his creator, because he thinks if anybody owes him something, then his father and creator does. He made me, so therefore he owes me something. He learns from the journal that he is from Geneva, and he knows enough basic geography because Felix taught to safety that he knows, okay, Geneva is in this direction, so he starts heading in that direction. Says he travels only at night through the dark and the cold of winter. He's traveling, trying to find his way, but he doesn't really know exactly how to go. So his anger and his bitterness grows more and more as he gets closer to his goal. Now, at one point, there's this very sad story in chapter 16 in which he sees a young girl playing in the woods. He's hiding in the woods, hiding behind trees, and he sees a young girl playing in the woods, and then the girl falls in the river. And the creature dives into the river and rescues her. Now, he's done a great good deed, and so you'd think that he would be rewarded for that. She is unconscious, and he tries to revive her and wake her up, but then suddenly a young man appears, grabs the girl out of his hands, and runs off into the woods. And the creature follows. He says he's not exactly sure why, but he just kind of like, he wants to make sure the girl is okay, and he wants in some way to be recognized for having done a good thing. But he says that the man that he calls the rustic takes out a gun, aims it, and shoots him in the shoulder. And then he says, this was then the reward of my benevolence. In other words, no good deed goes unpunished. So if that's what he gets for trying to help people, he decides, well, I'm not going to try to help people anymore. You notice he already swore to that a little earlier. That suggests that promise, that vow he's made in his head, it's kind of hard for him to hold to that, which again suggests that he is naturally good. He wants to do good things. And the idea of vowing that I'm not going to help somebody anymore, it's hard for him to hold to that. But now he says again, I vowed eternal hatred and vengeance on all mankind for doing this, for rejecting me and shooting me when he was trying to just help a girl and save a person. And then we come to the episode with William. The creature finally reaches the area that's around Geneva. And while he's trying to decide how he can find or talk to his creator, because he knows the Frankenstein lives in Geneva, but he doesn't really know how to get in there, or how to find one person in a whole city. He doesn't really want to go in there and be seen. And so while he's trying to decide what to do, he says a little boy comes by. And then he suddenly thinks, well, here is an innocent child. This child doesn't know enough to be horrified by my ugliness. He says, I could take this child to be my companion and my friend, and I could train him up to be not afraid of me. But it doesn't work. The minute he grabs the child screams in terror. He calls him a monster. He actually calls him an ogre. He says, you are an ogre and you're going to eat me. And the creature's like, no, you need to stop screaming. And then the child says, you don't dare hurt me. My father is Monsieur Frankenstein. He reveals that his father's name is Frankenstein. Now, this ends up being a very bad move by this 5 to 6 year old child that had done this. Because when the monster hears this, he says, you are Frankenstein? Well, then that means that you belong to my enemy. And now, you notice that Frankenstein immediately called the creature my enemy before he'd done anything. But at this point, the monster is returning that. he now also considers Frankenstein to be his enemy. He says, "You will be my first victim." This is his first victim. And so the monster kills William, just strangles him to death. Now that's a terrible thing to have done. But in a way, you can kind of see how that despair leads him to this. And it says he exults in his power. He says, yes, as much pain as I felt, now I can cause the same pain in others. And so he says, I'm not helpless. I'm not hopeless. I can have the power to hurt just as I've been hurt. And he's glad that he can think that his death is going to cause his creator to feel pain. And then he sees the portrait. So it's kind of cool. We kind of thought that the reason why he was killed was for this jewel around his neck, but Monster doesn't even see it until after he's killed William. He takes the portrait, and for a moment he's delighted by the beauty of the picture of the woman in it. But then he remembers that here's a woman that would only hate me on sight. And so then he's again overcome with the rage. Why am I constantly rejected? And then he goes to hide himself in a barn. And here's another plot contrivance coincidence. In this barn, he finds a young woman sleeping. And this is Justine Moritz, because we knew from a previous chapter that she had slept in a barn because she couldn't get into the house, into the city rather, because the gates had been shut. And the monster wishes that this creature, this woman, would wake up and just smile at him, because then he thinks if she would just smile at me, I would be gentled and I would forgive everybody. But he knows that if she woke up, she would hate him too. And so he decides, you know what? I'm going to ruin this woman's life just because I know that she would act the same as all the others. Now, you want to notice something about this. The monster is judging Justine on sight, just as so many others have judged him. He doesn't give her a chance to turn out to be a better person. Now, I think the monster's probably correct. I mean, all experience that he's had so far shows that whenever anybody sees him, they are terrified and try to hurt him. So he's probably right, but he doesn't know that. For the first time, the monster is judging others by what they look like, just as they are judging him. Perhaps he's been taught that. So instead of waking her up, he leaves the portrait in her pocket and departs. And he mentions that he knows that by seeing this, when she has this in him, she will bear the blame of my murder. So he did know what he was doing. He was deliberately pinning it on Justine. So it turns out Richter was right. The monster did cause the deaths of both William and Justine. And then we come to the monster's whole point. He said at the beginning he had a proposal. And he finishes his story, and then he tells Frankenstein what his proposal is. He begs that Frankenstein will make him a companion. Make him a wife. He wants it to be deformed and horrible just like himself, so that it will not turn away from him, because he is lonely, and that is why he is miserable. He says, if I had a friend, a companion, then I would be good again. And so Frankenstein alone, he says, has the power to do this. You alone have the power to make me happy. And he swears that if he does this, that he will become good and he won't cause any more troubles. Now, we're going to continue reading this. I'll do another one of these a little bit later, but continue reading. If you haven't read these chapters on your own, read them on your own. I've given you just summaries, not the whole thing. So, and continue reading, sending me copies of what you're doing. I hope you're enjoying it. If you have the opportunity, see if you can get a hold of the 1931 Universal movie, which is totally, totally different. But my plan before was to show that to you when we had finished reading the novel, and I would love to be able to have a discussion about it if possible. But in the meantime, stay safe, keep washing your hands, and keep reading Frankenstein. I'll hopefully see you again soon.